Доброго дня усім! Вітаю вас в нашому віртуальному Free Market Roadshow. Ми мали зустрітися з вами ще в травні, але, на жаль, ситуація у всьому світі дещо змінила наші плани. Тим не менше, ми все рівно змогли зібрати наших шановних американських спікерів для того, щоб поговорити на таку тему. Це свобода та інновації проти кризи та регулювання. Отже, сьогодні до нас доєдналися такі добре знайомі вам, вони не перший раз беруть участь у такій події. Це Ден Мітчелл, Джон Чизм і Джон Фанд. Ден Мітчелл є головою Центру для свободи та процвітання. Джон Чизм є відомим автором. Для прикладу, така книга, як Unleash Your Company, Unleash Your Inner Company, та є керівником Chisholm Venture. І Джон Фан є дописувачем для National Review Magazine та foxnews.com. So, welcome in Kyiv, even though it's virtual. So thank you for joining us today or tonight right now. And I'm very happy to see you guys and hope next time we will be able to meet in person. To begin our discussion today, I would like to ask all of you the same question. What is your experience of COVID-19, of the lockdown, and what are you witnessing in your home cities? As I know you're all in different places in the US right now. So what about you, Dan?
Well, the good news in Washington is that there's no traffic. It's normally a very bad traffic city, but all the bureaucrats have been able to stay home. And of course, without bureaucrats and politicians, all the lobbyists and special interest groups, they stay home as well. So if you have to drive any place, it's been a wonderful couple of months. Now, of course, if you own a small business or something like that, it's been a terrible couple of months. I have mostly, of course, been continuing with my think tank type work, so it doesn't really interfere with that. I have been writing a lot about the coronavirus and the public policy issues, and there are some things that are still very unsettled, such as the trade-off between how many lives do you lose by opening up the economy versus how many lives you lose by keeping the economy shut down. And of course, politicians usually ignore that latter group of people when they're doing their calculations. But now that we're in the middle of riots in the United States and nobody's social distancing anymore, it seems like coronavirus has slipped off the pages almost overnight. And what will be interesting to see, and I'll close up my introductory remarks with this observation, some states have already reopened. And of course, we now have these riots all across America. Will there be an uptick in infections? Will there be a new surge or a new spike in coronavirus? If there is, then we have a problem. But if there isn't an uptick, if we don't have a noticeable surge in infections, then I think the entire country is just going to say, the heck with it, let's reopen and get back to normal, which of course, from an economic perspective, would be a very desirable outcome.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. John Chisholm, let's start with you.
Well, both the virus and the unrest are definitely lemons. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean to minimize them at all. But as the saying goes, when you get a lemon, make lemonade. And for me, the shutdown has been a very productive time. And I think if there is any goal that you that you're working towards, this is a good time to focus on it. We don't have the normal interruptions that we often have. And of course, I'm saying this from the standpoint of a person who can work remotely, and that's not by any means all or maybe even most of our population. But those of us who have the freedom to or the ability to work remotely, this is a time to get things done. I'm working on the paperback version of my book, Unleash Your Inner Company, updating it, making edits to it. I'm able to reach out to people, do interviews. I've lost 17 pounds during this period because I've been focused. I haven't been traveling as I normally do. Actually, the 17 pounds is over the last 6 months, but more than half of it has been over the last 2 or 3 months. And so I've focused on diet, exercise, and working out more so than normal. And so, you know, whatever the circumstances are, think about what you can do. And these are the things I'm able to do at this time. And for everybody, of course, they'll be different.
Okay, thank you. What about you, John?
Well, as you know, the United States is 330 million people and 50 states. We have a decentralized structure, so every story is different. I live in New York City, and that was the epicenter of the virus. We now know in retrospect that over 60% of our deaths were from nursing home cases, and many of those people died because people who had been ill of the virus were ordered back to the nursing home by the state. A senseless tragedy. And so the lockdown here has been very severe. And now, of course, we have the social unrest. I was able to get out to Colorado, Wyoming, and South Dakota last week. Completely different experience. Wyoming and South Dakota never locked down. They were basically untouched. Wyoming has had 8 deaths, 8 from coronavirus, for example. Denver is now reopened. And what it makes me realize is if the media and social capital of the country, New York, got this virus in the way that it did and was very harsh because of the transit patterns from China and Europe, it overreacted because there were so many people in media, politics, and business who were here and obviously felt it very personally. If the major outbreak of the epicenter had been in Albuquerque, sorry, we have a social unrest alert here in the middle of the day. If the, let me turn off my phone.
Citywide curfew for NYC, 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. nightly 6 halves minus 6 7.
I'm sorry, they're just giving us the curfew notice.
Essential workers exempt.
Sorry.
That's life.
Well, I hope not for long. But if this epicenter had been in Albuquerque, New Mexico, or in Memphis, Tennessee, or anywhere else, I doubt that we would have seen the kind of lockdowns that we did, or the level of overreaction. So it just goes to show that supposedly our betters and the people who should know better were in charge of all of this. I think they operated far more emotionally than they did analytically. And I think that's coming to light now. I mean, we have the Prime Minister of Sweden, the Prime Minister of Norway, I should say, which locked down very severely compared to neighboring Sweden. The Prime Minister of Norway now admitting that she operated primarily out of fear in locking down her country. Then we have Professor Neil Ferguson, we can discuss this later, of Imperial College London, the author of the infamous model that caused Britain to lock down and to some extent the United States. He's now admitted that Sweden handled it differently, but just as well as Britain did, but without the enormous costs of extra deaths due to suicide, depression, alcoholism, and various other things. So I am glad that I've survived and that my family and those close to me have. I'm just very sad for so much of the population that suffered so much. And in retrospect, it will be seen as often needlessly.
Okay, thank you. So let's go deeper right now into the costs of lockdown and this emotional response to the crisis and the policies brought around by the efforts to fight COVID-19. Dan, you wanted to say something about that, right?
Yeah, I do. Let me put a couple of slides up on the screen that I think will help make the point, assuming I can find it. There's the share screen thing. Um, here is here's a slide showing the 5 major public policy areas that that determine how prosperous a country is: size of government, legal system and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade, regulation. What we're dealing with during the coronavirus is governments primarily impacting areas 1 and 3. They're spending a lot of money, in some cases cutting taxes, but they're definitely doing things with their public finances that are causing lots of additional debt, and they're involving central banks in what are, for the most part, unprecedented schemes to give them the ability to prop up private companies to intervene in capital markets in ways that I fear are going to backfire against us. I want to say just a couple of things about the fiscal policy side of this that I think are worth noting. Let me go to a different slide here. Here's a slide. Well, assuming I can do it, it's not cooperating. I have there we go. I have a slide showing the amount of additional government spending that's occurred during the lockdown. Let me put share screen on again. You can see the red part on the screen is the additional spending. This is measured government spending per household by the federal government. You can see the giant spike upward in terms of what's been happening with our various so-called stimulus schemes in the United States. And of course, there'll be an ongoing cost because of the additional interest on the debt. And then if we look specifically at the interest on the debt, let's now shift to another slide here. You'll see that the debt is going up dramatically over time, $8 trillion basically over the 10-year period. Now, I'm normally not someone who worries too much about government debt. I think government debt is the symptom. The underlying problem is government being too big. The main reason I'm sharing this chart, just like in the previous chart on government spending, you can see in the blue part that it was already on an upward trajectory. So I think what's happening, not only in the United States, but in other countries around the world, we're in a situation where almost certainly there's going to be another fiscal crisis. I would be shocked if Italy doesn't have a Greek-style fiscal crisis in Europe. I suspect other European countries will go through the same thing. And of course, the United States, we have probably a lot more leeway. We probably even have decades of leeway before we hit that point. But the underlying thing we should be concerned about is government is too big. It was already growing too fast before the coronavirus. And now governments have done all this spending in reaction to the coronavirus, combined with the fact that the economies have been hurt so severely that reduces tax revenues. We're seeing an explosion in government debt. And the question is, what's going to happen in the future? I fear that the political sentiment now is a very bad one, where a lot of countries are going to impose class warfare taxes, wealth taxes, higher income tax rates, higher business taxes, new energy taxes. It's going to be a very unfriendly economic environment where politicians, in effect, try to keep all that new spending, not let it go away when the coronavirus abates, and in effect have a sort of a big one-time increase in the burden of government, which of course simply means the economy will get weaker. So when we're looking specifically at fiscal policy, I think it's a very, very grim situation in most countries around the world. I'll close with one caveat that's very, very hard to predict. I mentioned Italy before, and I think the very high likelihood that they'll have a Greek-style fiscal crisis. well, what if the European Central Bank decides that they'll just endlessly buy new Italian government debt? In theory, I guess that means Italy can basically be implicitly subsidized by the rest of the Eurozone, by the rest of the European Union. Now, will the Germans go along with that? There are so many things we can't predict right now, but I guess the big wild card in all this is what's going to happen with central banks. They're already intervening in terms of economic support. They're already intervening in terms of capital markets. Are they going to intervene in a massive way in government debt markets? And there's no way of predicting that, but if they do all those things, it won't end well in the long run. They could probably prop things up and paper things over in the short run, but I'll be very worried about the long run consequences.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Daniel. What about you guys? Do you want to add something to the discussion of policies?
Yes. I do think there's a growing consensus that the harm being done by the government-imposed shutdown is now exceeding the harm that was done by the virus in the first place. And that, in my view, the lowest hanging fruit for getting back to a healthy economic situation is alleviating regulation. And the proof of this is in the regulations that have been temporarily alleviated during the lockdown with no negative consequences, showing that they they shouldn't have been in place in the first place. Let me give you 4 examples. Number 1, e-scooters and e-bikes have been disallowed in many cities, including San Francisco, where I live, because they're a good way for people to get around without and still allowing social distancing. They've been allowed during this period. No negative consequences there. Number 2, telemedicine and doctors' fees. Doctors prior to this have not been allowed to charge the same fees or for telemedicine that they used face-to-face, or not, or in some cases, telemedicine has just been disallowed. Well, that's difficult when people possibly have the virus, and so telemedicine is a natural way to deal with that. That has been alleviated in some states with no negative consequences. Restaurant takeout required a separate license in many cities, including here in San Francisco. That license the need for it has been alleviated so that any restaurant now can do takeout. Clearly, that was intended to protect some restaurants against others that did takeout, the ones that didn't do takeout. Again, no negative consequences. Commercial truck regulation have also been alleviated. So all of these show so many of our regulations should not have been on the books in the first place. They don't benefit the public overall. They benefit a specific group who is influential, who's politically important, or they generate revenues for government, or they protect either a government agency or an important group, a politically important group, from risk, perhaps from competition. So this is the lowest hanging fruit to get back. If we can scrutinize all of our regulations and say, how many of them can we eliminate to give people the most freedom to innovate, to come up with new solutions that'll address the current set of needs that people have, which are different now, not just during the lockdown, but even after. The way people live, the way people work has changed. People need the freedom to explore, try out things, and come up with new solutions that'll support and facilitate life after the lockdown. So those are some thoughts.
Okay, thank you. But what about you, John?
Well, I think that Dan and John have made excellent points. To move in a different direction, I would say that one of the costs of the lockdowns, at least in the United States, which we did not fully appreciate until the last few days, is what it was doing to young people. We can all remember when we were 20 years old and very much full of energy. And the last thing you want to do to someone in the beginning of their adult years or their career is to cage them, even though they're healthy, and fill them with despair. There's a new study that will be published tomorrow by Joel Hay of the University of Southern California. He is a professor of pharmaceutical studies. He and 8 colleagues took survey samples of people, both in face-to-face interviews and over the internet, and also online, and also indirectly, and concluded that while people over the age of 65 have had marginal, although clear, negative impacts from being locked down, and people in the middle years of their life have coped fairly well, under the age of 30, it has been devastating. In terms of life years, we have lost a great deal. People's education has been disrupted, people's jobs have vanished, and we all know that many of the jobs that young people held aren't going to come back. So if you also look at inner cities, where you have a population that's often disadvantaged, the kind of pent-up emotions that were released in the last few days after the horrific Floyd killing are not that surprising. It was a tinderbox waiting to be let alight. So to all the costs of the lockdown, by the way, Zoloft, the pharmaceutical prescription for antidepressant, is now in short supply. You can't get it in many places now because so many people are using it. In all of this, what we are getting is a terrible, terrible toll, not just in health, not just in lost output, not just in jobs destroyed, but frankly, now it's indirectly related to the increase in violence as young people take out their frustrations on the street. And whether they have pure motives or less pure motives is not as important as the damage that they're causing and the tearing of the social fabric. And I think that we can't just look at the costs of these lockdowns in dollar and cent terms or euro and cent terms. We have to look at the costs in lost human life potential.
That's absolutely crucial. And if we want to wrap up the topic of coronavirus and its impact, so we can look at it as a crisis, a major crisis, or we can look at it as a major disruption with possible positive outcomes, right, for the future, if we're talking about regulation, some of the changes, if these changes, stick, and if they're not temporary. So let's try to think about life and world after COVID-19. Maybe positive scenarios, maybe negative, maybe more pragmatic scenarios. What do you guys think?
I'll go ahead and jump in on this question because I want to add something to what John Chisholm was saying about potentially getting rid of bad regulations. One thing we've learned from this unfortunate episode is that 2 bureaucracies in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration and the Centers for Disease Control, their regulations and red tape played a very negative role in terms of the deployment and utilization of testing. And with any luck, I'm not overly optimistic because politicians on the committees that oversee these bureaucracies will be reluctant, I think, to give up power. But with any luck, we'll see some long-run reforms. There already have been some temporary suspension and relaxation of some of the regulation from these government bureaucracies. But given the evidence of how badly these bureaucracies performed and how they held up and hindered the development and deployment of things like testing, I have a little bit of hope that we might see some progress in the long run in that area.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else to add? John, unmute yourself, please.
I'm sorry. I would just add that in regard to the civil unrest in the United States that we've seen, the Supreme Court may be will be considering several appeals to hear cases regarding the doctrine of qualified immunity. What that is a doctrine that the Supreme Court first promulgated in 1982, so it's within the lifetimes of many of us. And it basically said that if you're suing a government entity for a violation of your rights, the course of action is very narrow and has to be very specific. In practical terms, although the court said in 1982 it didn't intend this, it has meant giving a license to government misbehavior, whether it's police officers, whether it's government bureaucrats, exercising civil forfeiture, which seizes property of people who are under arrest and suspicion but have not been convicted, a whole range of situations, including environmental regulations and others. This has been a license to abuse people's rights. So I think there's a good chance the Supreme Court will hear these cases, and given the fact that one of the problems in our police forces in the United States is the doctrine of qualified immunity has made it very difficult to discipline police officers. When you take that and combine it with the power of police unions to protect their members, to hide the records of disciplinary actions against them, to demand arbitration, to sue to have them reinstated, it's very difficult to fire bad apples in police departments. And I say this with some experience. My brother was the deputy chief of police in Tucson, Arizona for many years. And the worst thing he had to deal with was the fact that the police union and the doctrine of qualified immunity gave a lot of police officers the sense that they couldn't be touched if they misbehaved. And if you hire 100 people to be police officers, you're going to get one sociopath, you're going to get one psychopath, you're going to get one, person interested in sadism. You have to weed those people out over time. And if police unions and qualified immunity doctrines make that very difficult, you're going to fray the trust that must be established between authority figures in the community, especially the minority communities. So I look to those areas, as well as the economic areas and drug regulatory areas that Dan and John mentioned, as places where we finally have a wake-up call, and the costs of these failures to discipline government officials are now all too evident.
Okay. And right now we have this unique opportunity to look at and analyze the way a major crisis is handled worldwide. And in most places, we see this tendency to give up on freedom and go back to depending on the state to resolve all the issues. If we're talking about alternative ways for handling a crisis, any crisis, and if we're looking at basically the opposite option, at freedom and innovation, what should be their role in dealing with situations like these?
Well, on an optimistic note, I'll observe two ways that things have gotten better, one in the last couple of decades and one in the last century that we tend to overlook. In the last few decades, first, I didn't hear, and I don't hear, and I don't think we've heard anyone defending the officer who killed George Floyd. His behavior was simply reprehensible. And I think there's a growing sensitivity and awareness throughout the United States, at least, that this kind of police brutality is just not acceptable. Had this incident taken place 10 or 20 years ago, I think it might well have been different. I think there might have been a significant number of people or percentage of the US population who supported the cop. And part of that is thanks to technology. We have video cameras in all of our pockets now. 20 years ago, we didn't have that. And so that's a good thing that we have to thank innovation and technological progress for. Longer term, if you go back a century or more to, say, the Spanish flu virus of 1918, there's no way back at that time that a quarter of the population, or maybe as much as 40%, whatever it is today, could work remotely. The notion of going online and working remotely didn't even exist a century ago. And so in that sense, our economy is much more resilient today than it was a century ago. I can well imagine and hope that 2 or 3 decades from now, substantially all of the US economy could work at home if necessary, thanks to advancing technology. Those are some ways that technology has been good that we tend to overlook. I do have some additional thoughts on what the many aspiring entrepreneurs and actual entrepreneurs in your audience in Ukraine can do during this time, but I think that's a future question, right? So I'll leave.
We'll go back to that.
Yes, thank you.
Can I add something to what John just said? Maybe he's a glass half full and I'm a glass half empty person. But when I think about the difference between today compared to 100 years ago with the Spanish flu, we have a massive welfare state today. And we have politicians giving people money to be unemployed. As a matter of fact, we're giving them a bonus amount of $600 to be unemployed. That's going to slow down dramatically people's reentry into the workforce. And I do worry that just the extent of our welfare state and all the redistribution programs have created a system where work is now less attractive and there's more of a dependency mindset and more of just a view that I think is an erosion of societal capital, a view that, oh, it's the job of government to take care of us. And I think the coronavirus may have moved us one farther step in the wrong direction of that dependency mindset. And I think that's one of the problems that Greece had, and one of the problems Italy has, one of the reasons they had and are heading toward fiscal crisis. So I think societal capital, the mores, the work ethic, the social ethics of a people are very important. And I do think government has moved us in the wrong direction on that issue compared to 100 years ago, even though, yes, thankfully we've made progress in some other areas like race relations and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we are at a tie. John, can you be the tiebreaker here?
I'll go right down the middle. I want to discuss briefly 2 points. One is censorship and one is the precautionary principle. The internet brings with it both great benefits and a lot of frustrations. But I've been very worried over the course of these lockdowns and the virus that there have been a lot of attempts to censor people on the internet. YouTube has removed people, Facebook has removed people, the Medium, the website of where people can post things, has removed people. And it's basically been people who have tried to bring an alternative view of science and regulation to the table. And this is very disturbing. We need dissidents. This is what distinguishes us from China, which gave us the original idea that you can lock down an entire society for the first time in history. And rather than protect the old, the frail, and the vulnerable, you imprison the healthy. This is a novel concept. And I think if there is one thing that was not discussed at the beginning of these lockdowns is how unprecedented this was. This had never been done before, and there was no science backing it up. And in fact, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx in the United States admitted that. So we need the dissidents and we need the internet to remain free. And I'm disappointed that so many people on the left who used to speak out in favor of free speech have allowed this to happen. And even some on the right have allowed this to happen. Secondly, the precautionary principle. We have leaked emails from the Danish Ministry of Health and the Danish government in which the government officials in charge, the political appointees, told the health experts, you will not act as scientists. You must act in a political way. You cannot release data that shows that the transmissibility is dropping below. because we're about to extend the lockdown. You can't do that. That's a mixed message. The precautionary principle must be what guides you. We have leaked emails from other countries, such as Germany, that also buttress this point. We need to have everyone in the freedom movement start working on the issue of the politicization of science. We were told to follow the science. In the irony of it was, what we really were doing, we're following the politicians who were telling the scientists to shut up. Look at what happened in Britain. The mad modeler, Neil Ferguson, whose nickname in the profession of epidemiology is the master of disaster, because he's always wrong. He did bring the wrong model to the table, but there was no consensus in the scientific advisory board, the SAGE group around Boris Johnson, that his model made sense. In fact, he still to this day has not released the original model so it can be tested. He's released a revised version. God knows what that hides. And he gave a presentation on the House of Lords just this past few days, in which he basically admitted that Sweden has had a good result with the virus and without the incredible costs of the lockdowns that Britain had. So what did they do in Britain? There was no scientific consensus. They went from doing the Swedish approach to a complete and total lockdown, far worse than even the United States. And they not only now have 50,000 dead in a nation of 60 million, but they have a wrecked economy and a complete violation of civil liberties. We need to keep the internet free, and we need to go after the people who have made the precautionary principle their new religion, their new God, because we now see what worshiping false gods has brought us.
Okay. And so we mentioned the costs of lockdowns a couple of times, and we see that economically speaking, a lot of countries are in trouble because of coronavirus. And the governments are trying to come up with different ways to stimulate the economy through cash, through different, fiscal programs and things like that. And we are talking about the need to, lessen the regulation, give people more freedom, give people more opportunities to be creative, to come up with different innovations. So how can we create favorable conditions for these economies? What do they need to thrive if we are not talking about bailouts, which are usually, the first option in these cases? So what can we do differently? What kind of regulation in the broad scheme of things should we be looking at to alleviate?
Well, go ahead.
Okay. Before the coronavirus, we had a roadmap published every year by the Fraser Institute, Economic Freedom of the World, with those 5 categories that I showed a slide of. And those are still today. That's still the correct recipe for how you get more economic growth. There's no great mystery, I think, to prosperity in the world. You need a vibrant private sector creating jobs, boosting incomes, creating more prosperity, lifting people out of poverty. That's never driven by government. It's always been a function of the private sector generating the growth and the prosperity of a country. And it's always been because they sufficiently follow, not perfectly follow. Even Hong Kong and Singapore have policy mistakes. And of course, Hong Kong probably will have a lot more soon. But even the best of countries make some policy mistakes. But the point is, you simply have to give the private sector enough breathing room to generate growth. And that means less red tape, lower tax rates, a smaller burden of government spending, more stable non-interventionist monetary policy, open trade, and just good quality public institutions for things like rule of law and protection of legal rights. And I'm not very optimistic that a lot of governments are going to travel down that path. A lot of people will have suffered permanent income losses as a result of the coronavirus. Some industries will not come back. Some sectors of the economy will suffer long-term harm. And it's just totally predictable that politicians will try to exploit economic unease and anxiety with demagoguery and class warfare. So I'm not optimistic about the United States adopting good policy in the future. And I'm not optimistic about most of Europe. As a matter of fact, if we speak specifically about the European Union, the people in Brussels and in some national capitals are trying to exploit the virus by getting their long-held dream of EU-wide taxation and spending. So Brussels getting direct taxing authority, using the bailout fund as a way of permanently getting spending authority. The last thing Europe needs is another layer of taxes and spending on a continent that already is suffering from government that is far too big and costs far too much. I hope either of the two Johns has a more optimistic story to tell, because I'm just not very cheerful about the prospects.
Yes, John, please help us out. Bring some optimism into the discussion.
Well, as you can tell, I'm usually an optimist, but I agree with Dan and John on these points. John's point about the precautionary principle, we've become so risk averse, and innovation without risk is impossible. There are lots of experiments, lots of trials that have to be done to discover where there's a good fit between human and customer needs on the one hand, and new solutions and technologies on the other. Most of those experiments will not be successful. Only a few of them will be. And so we need to do lots of experiments, and we need to have everybody experimenting and trying and searching for those fits. I think of drones in the United States, for example. Drones could be serving many more useful services in the US and worldwide than they currently are. They could be painting our houses. They could be watering or identifying where crops need to be watered. They could be used much more widely for sports, for entertainment, for they could have the intelligence built into them to avoid other flying objects and other drones and stationary objects. I could go on and on. Mm-hmm. They could be being used to identify victims of earthquakes so that we could find them. But the usage of drones is still very minimal in the US. Basically, you still need a waiver to use a drone for commercial purposes. They can only be up to 400 feet. They can only, without a waiver, they have to have a dedicated operator. It's only visual distance rules apply. I could go on and on. As a result, the drone industry in the US, which should be a very healthy, vibrant industry, is very minimal. And by far the leading drone manufacturer is not US, but Chinese, DJI technology. One thing that saddens me deeply and troubles me is that the under 30 crowd seems especially complacent and willing to, without any objection, to go along with these shutdowns and regulations and sheltering at home and so forth. I would have hoped they would be just a bit more raising of what an impact it is on their personal lives, their work lives, their productivity, etc., to be subject to these draconian lockdowns. But I don't see as much of that as I would like. And I worry that there's been a continuous process of becoming more and more risk averse every year, generation after generation. And if that's the case, we really will have a limitation in the advance of innovation.
Okay.
So I share the concerns that Dan and John have raised.
Mm-hmm. John, do you have anything else to add?
Well, I do think that any of your listeners who are either entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, or actually running small businesses today, that there is a lot they can do even during a shutdown. And I think it behooves us to remember that, actually, regardless of what we're doing, there's a lot we can do during a shutdown. Again, making lemonade when we get a lemon. And there's no doubt about it, the virus and the shutdowns have been lemons. The key to, first of all, what are the friends and what are the enemies to an entrepreneur? Well, the enemies are all the distractions, the limitations, the regulations, but there are also things like TV and YouTube and Netflix, entertainment that's taking us away from whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. And I'm blessed and have been for the last 20 years. I don't have a TV set. And so I'm less tempted to be distracted, perhaps, than I would be otherwise. What are the friends? The friends are the fact that we don't have the normal interruptions, as I mentioned before, day to day. And so that gives us more time, if we take advantage of it, in many cases at least, to focus on whatever business we're trying to get off the ground. If you're in the very early stages of starting your business, where you're still trying to determine the fit between customer needs and a solution, this is a great time to reach out to prospective customers, grill them, talk with them about what their needs are. It's a great time to explore the possibilities of new technologies, solutions, subassemblies, components, and see how you might create a fit between a customer need and a solution. Needs are changing right now, big time, very rapidly. And part of the tough calculus that an entrepreneur has to do is figure out which of those needs, those new needs, are going to survive the lockdown indefinitely and which ones are going to be relatively short-lived. You know, of course, that there are lots of new needs that we have. We can't go to our gyms, but we need to stay physically fit. We need to get deliveries of food. We can't travel. We can't stay in touch as readily with loved ones. All of these are new customer needs. Some of them will long survive the shutdown. And so if there are ones that are particularly good fits with your skills, knowledge, relationships, and passions, you may well be the best person on earth to address one or more needs for your community or your city or what have you. If you're further along in your business and you already are delivering a product or service, maybe you have a small team, this is likely to be a very hard time. Probably your number one priority is just survival. You may have to make some difficult choices. In the dot-com bust, I had to lay off 40% of our workforce for my second company that I was running at that time, cut back salaries by 20%, move to smaller offices, factor receivables. It was really tough. But here's the good news that people often forget and overlook. The years immediately following the dot-com bust, 2002, 2003, were the most profitable years in our company's history because we were so mean and so lean. So if you can just get through these hard times, there are better times ahead because the economy will recover. Many of your competitors will go out of business. There will be an opportunity to pick up or acquire either competitors or resources at fire sale prices. And that leaves me with my last point, which is a key lesson about tough times that I don't hear enough people talking about, is that it's really important to put something aside for a rainy day. Right now, it is raining. And I mean by that the economy is in tough times. Those individuals and businesses who over the last several years were frugal and built up their reserves are in a better position than those who did not. And beyond having more resources just to get through the downturn, they are in a position to acquire resources and perhaps even their competitors which will make them even stronger still. So take this lesson to heart. If you're not already doing so, start living and running your business frugally and saving something, no matter how modest, every month, because this will happen again. And if you do that, you'll be in a stronger position to get even stronger when that downturn happens.
Thank you. John?
I wanted to pick up on something Dan said when he hearkened back to the Spanish flu of 1918. I'm just old enough to remember the Hong Kong flu pandemic of 1969. And the reason why we should remember it is threefold. One, it was a world that was much closer to ours than the world of 1918. This was one of the first pandemics to be spread through international jet travel, like coronavirus was. But it was handled completely differently. Dan mentions the welfare state. Well, in 1969, the entire Great Society had been approved. So we had a welfare state, not as large as the one now, but it was big enough. There were no giant $3 trillion bailouts because we didn't shut down the schools or the businesses or the country. We soldiered on. The Hong Kong flu killed over 100,000 Americans. In today's population comparison, it was 165,000. We were a more resilient people. We were less risk averse, to pick up on what John Chisholm said. We did not follow the precautionary principle. We washed our hands, we kept social distancing, we disinfected things around us, and we went to work, and we went to school. And we threw our resources into a vaccine, and we got one in August of '69, only about 9 months after the pandemic hit our shores. I lived in the Bay Area of California. Travis Air Force Base, where the virus arrived because of returning soldiers from Vietnam who had vacationed in Hong Kong and brought the Hong Kong flu to the United States, was just down the road from me. I was in the epicenter, and we handled it completely differently. Woodstock, the great music festival that shaped modern music, was held in the middle of the pandemic. That's how different things were. The growth, the economic growth in 1969, and Dan Mitchell can, I think, testify to this, that was one of the last years, and that was one of the last years in 30 years that we had a balanced budget. Economic growth was 5% in 1969 in the middle of the pandemic. So what we have to do is, after this is over, and after we learn from all the leaked emails and the hearings and the investigations of just how politicized the process was in creating these lockdowns, we cannot let this bone go. We have to completely discredit these lockdowns. We have to total up the cost of the depressions and the suicides and the alcoholism and the extra weight that now people are carrying around and all of that. And we have to say never again. Never again will we imprison a healthy population and not protect the elderly, the frail, and the sick in the nursing homes. We must learn from this, and all of us have to take these lessons to heart and broadcast them. This is one of the greatest public policy disasters of history, and we cannot forget it, and we cannot let it go, because if we make our case, the case for the alternative, for something that was approaching 1969 and the pandemic and how we treated it then, will look all the stronger. We must say never again. And we must not let people claim that it was the lockdowns that ultimately alleviated the problem, because as the science is coming in, it is clear over and over again, the more you look at it, the lockdowns exacerbated things, and we cannot let people rewrite history into that direction. And I don't think there is a bigger cause that any of us can have in the public policy community right now than addressing these lockdowns, their consequences, and the lessons to be learned from them.
Can I add 2 points to what John just said?
Sure.
First, I'll give a caveat about 1969. Yeah, there were some good policies like the Kennedy tax cuts that were contributed to growth in the 1960s. But by the time we got to 69, I think there was also a bit of a bubble from Federal Reserve and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a good story to tell, but it's not a total story. But then I want to add to what John said on another point. He talked about how there have been some adverse health consequences of the lockdown in terms of depression, suicide, drug use, things like that. But there's also a long-term cost. There's a very well-established relationship in the academic literature between the wealth of a society, the prosperity of a society, and things like longevity. Basically, richer societies have longer lifespans and better health outcomes. And as a result of the lockdown and the economic, foregone economic output, and potentially, as I'm worried about, permanent losses of income as a result of the government interventions, that in and of itself is going to worsen our health outcomes in the long run. So you really do have to look at both sides of the equation. Yeah, did we save a few lives in terms of maybe even thousands of lives in terms of people who may have died from coronavirus? Yes, we probably did. That's the good news. But on the other side of the scale, when you're doing that cost-benefit analysis, the other side of the scale are both the short-term lives that are lost that John mentioned, but also the long-term premature deaths that will occur because we'll have a less wealthy society. And unfortunately, politicians, their time horizon is the next election. They usually don't think about the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's hope that we will, learn our lessons and analyze alternatives and talk about, really look into the costs for everything, because this is most likely not the last time we are faced with a major crisis like this. And hopefully in the future, we will be better prepared, first of all, and better at handling something like that. So thank you very much, guys, for joining me today. And hopefully, we will see each other next time under much better circumstances.
Good luck in
Looking
Ukraine.
forward to it.
Thank you for having us.